Hello, I'm Tom McDermott. I'm a pianist-composer who moved from St. Louis to New Orleans in 1984. I moved here primarily as a solo pianist with a little tiny bit of band work, and I worked for the first, I'd say 6 years as a solo pianist and a non-singing solo pianist, which makes it a little harder. But I, in fact, have been able to play piano pretty well from a young age. And when I started to, when I moved here, I started making it a point of really learning New Orleans music. I had known people like Jelly Roll Morton and trad jazz, traditional jazz, and we call it trad jazz from an early age. But then in around 80, 81, 82, I started getting into the New Orleans rhythm and blues piano heritage of Dr. John Professor Longhair and especially James Booker. And that was very exciting to me, especially like the simpler Professor Longhair things, which have these Cuban-American rhythms in the left hand, which were very exotic, nothing I'd ever encountered or tried to play, certainly, and not in sheet music form. So it was really opening a new rhythmic and expressive way of playing for me. So I got here, I missed Booker. He died in 83, and I did get to hear him on previous visits, but he had died by the time I moved in April 84. But there were still, quite a few of the greats around. I missed Professor Longhair, who died in 1980. But anyway, I continued playing traditional jazz, and I started playing a little bit with groups and developing my New Orleans R&B repertoire via the piano music, at least. And then also augmenting it with, for instance, Brazilian music, which I first heard, at least the particular type I pursued, which is called choro music, first heard in 1984, the year I moved here. And eventually came to be a lover of all manner of Brazilian music, especially that which is purely Brazilian and not tainted so much by, now there's all these hybrids. There's Brazilian rap and Brazilian reggae and Brazilian hip hop and all that. But that doesn't interest me as much, or nearly as much, as the purely old pre-samba, choro, samba, bossa nova, and a lot of those are, especially choro. So that, and you live here and you meet Cuban musicians as well, and you learn about the connection between Cuba and New Orleans, and you realize that a lot of what you thought began in New Orleans actually begins in Cuba, because they've had music there for 200 years before New Orleans was created, and it was the seat of Spanish Empire. And so a lot of the rhythms, like the tresillo, boom, 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 but that you, without much thinking, would think, oh, that comes from Professor Longhair or maybe Jimmy Yancey. But in fact, that rhythm can be traced all the way to India, and it came through the Gypsies and eventually made it to Iberia, Northern Africa, on 2 different paths, and then from Spain to Cuba, Spain and Africa to Cuba, and that's where it really got disseminated. Or the tango rhythm. And you find out the histories about all these. The writer Ned Sublette has been very important to me in the last 10 years. I met him actually the year before Katrina, when he moved here to do a fellowship to write his second book. And I recommend all 4 of his books very highly. He wrote first a history of Cuban music, which is also a history of Cuba up to 1950. Then he wrote a history of New Orleans called The World That Made New Orleans up to 1830, just that far. And then he wrote a book about his year spent here, which was the last year before the flood, called The Year Before the Storm, or The Year Before the Flood. And that's a great overview of, it covers a lot of territory. And finally, he's written a book on the American Slave Coast, which is a 660-page history of everything you didn't know about slavery, and is a real punch in the gut and a real revisionist history of America. So he's been, in my last 10 years, very, very important for reconfiguring how I think of New Orleans and how I present it in concert when I do solo shows.
So can you describe some of those reconfigurations?
Yeah, well...
And has it affected the music as well as how you contextualize it?
Oh, well, you know, just the idea that, you know, I had always thought as a kid, I played ragtime. I discovered the music of Joplin right before the Sting, but right after a fellow named Joshua Rifkin, who was a Bach musicologist and did other things as well. But he recorded these very well-studied versions of Joplin, which took it as serious classical music and not as honky-tonk people with straw hats and garters and Shakey's Pizza and all that, but as concert music. And they were art house favorites, and I got into that. So I thought for a long time that ragtime was kind of the beginning of you could say the ascendancy of African American music via its rhythmic strengths. But in fact, through Ned, I learned that, say for instance, we think of, how many times have you heard a ragtime end with dun 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 dun, right? It's a cliche that's in thousands of pieces. Well, ba-ba-da-ba-da, that's the first 5 notes of that, is a rhythm called the cinquillo, and that comes from Saint-Domingue, now Haiti. So I had the revelation that ragtime rhythm comes from Haiti, and that was like, what, you know? So ragtime, in fact, was not, you know, we had minstrel music and all that, but ragtime was international music. It swept, and I thought it was the fulcrum that opened up the world to jazz and swing and R&B and everything that came after. But in fact, it was probably the notation of the Cuban habanera rhythm, which starts, and I learned this from Ned, in around 1805 or so, are the first written examples. Before that, there were no recordings, of course, so the only way you could experience music was through live performance. But once it was written down, then it could be transmitted all over the world by anybody who could read music. So this begins in Spain, where you know, Europeans start writing melodies with these African rhythms, with the bum ba dum bum bum bum, a rhythm which is called the tango rhythm. It's also called the habanera rhythm. Habanera meaning is a feminine from Havana, and that rhythm travels all over the world. It really doesn't get connected to really interesting music, strangely, until Louis Moreau Gottschalk, who's a first great New Orleans composer we know of, and the first great American composer, Ned Sublette would say, until he, and who is well trained in European music and grew up in New Orleans and heard these Afro-Cuban rhythms, he starts writing music in the 1840s. And he's in Europe and he creates a sensation with 4 pieces. He also makes his public recital in Paris after being denied entrance at the Paris Conservatoire because he was American. He finds teachers and develops his craft, and he makes his public debut at age 16, playing a Chopin piano concerto with Chopin in the audience. And then, but makes his name, but there's plenty of young virtuosos always, everywhere. He makes his name by writing these pieces, Bamboula, La Bagnée, maybe Pasquinade, and what that are nothing like the Europeans have ever heard. And so anyway, this is really the beginning of the spread of the influence of African music via that rhythm. And it takes a while, it takes until the recording era for it to really gather even more steam. But so there's an example.
Awesome. So tell me a little bit about your life in New Orleans now. What are the things that you see in young artists here or in your contemporaries, people that you think are pushing the music scene, are the virtuosos of this time? I'm a little curious about what's going on now. People said, Katrina devastated the city.
Yes.
And that was clear for a while, but there's also been a lot of resilience and rebuilding. And so I'm kind of curious about that in the music.
Okay, well, right after Katrina, you heard phrases like cultural Armageddon, said he's never going to be the same. And in fact, for a long time, it was 60% of the city. Now it's back up to, 80%. I don't know what the figure is. Plus, there have been a lot of people moving here, either for several factors. Either to come help rebuild. They came here and they said, this is great. 2, the TV HBO series Treme, I think, turned on a lot of people. 3, the gentrification of places like the Bay Area. Of course, that's been going on a long time, but now it's reached a fever pitch, as I understand it, and New York City, both bohemian hubs of musicians. So there's a lot of musicians moving into town. I just met one 2 nights ago who might be the best fiddler probably in town. He's a young kid, and as I remarked to another St. Louis, and I said, man, every time you turn around, there's a new monster in town. And he said, yeah, it's inspiring, which is how I feel. I've lost my train of thought. Yes, at first it looked bad. And indeed, for many neighborhoods, we're getting now, didn't begin right after Katrina. It took a while to gather steam, but say in the last 3-4 years, we've had our own gentrification. It came late here. But basically, for my travels around the world, any city that's desirable is getting gentrified. London, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, the Bay Area, New York, Boston, any place that you would want to live in at all. There is a class now of Okay, say we use the term 1%. So in America, that would be 3 million people. 3 million millionaires. I know several who have 4 houses in 4 different places. And they're great people. I don't, they're welcome to do that. But at the same time, when applied to New Orleans, it's very problematic because the Quarter which hasn't been a neighborhood for a long time, but it is now culturally dead. There's not, Italian families passing recipes to each other or, people swapping musical ideas. It hasn't been that way. And the same thing is now happening to Treme, as houses now that once cost $20,000 cost, $400,000. It's spread into the Bywater and the Marigny. I lived in on what was the street? First street after the railroad, after Press Street. Can't think of it. Montague. I lived in there twice in the 80s when I was new to town. And you could get a house, it was a lot of crime, so you could get a house for $10,000 there. And now there's nothing in the Marigny or the Bywater for less than $200,000 probably. So now it's gone over St. Claude into the 7th Ward, which has been a black neighborhood, but not for that long, actually. It only became a majority black neighborhood after a white flight, which was in the 1960s. Before that, it was mostly white. So gentrification, I think, in a way it's good because beautiful old buildings need to be saved, because that makes New Orleans as much as the music and the food. The music and the food can be regenerated, especially the food. Recipes can be discovered in old books and started up again. And people would argue that the food scene is stronger post-Katrina than before, because not only, there might be less of the old-time poor people's food, maybe you could call it, but there's more fusion food from people who come from other places and saying, oh, I like this raw material, let me see what I can do with it. Now, the bad side of gentrification, and there's much to that, for instance, New Orleans had a majority black population before Katrina. I think it was 69% at its highest. Now it's down to about 55%. But what that does not factor in is that a lot of the poor blacks were shut out of the housing projects, which were, for the most part, did not flood and were perfectly stable, and shunted off to New Orleans East, which has nothing to do with anything touristic. You never go there for any reason except to sleep, I think. I don't associate with any type of culture. So the core of New Orleans is definitely getting bleached. It's getting whiter. And it's getting Airbnb'd to a severe level, which is very bad. Not just because it brings rowdy frat boys on leave to quiet neighborhoods that have never had that sort of thing, but also because it takes away an apartment. It takes away a potential place. So when I moved here in '84, I didn't buy a house until 98. It took me a long time. Took me a long time to decide I really wanted to live here. I bought a house, $69,000, put down $14,000, paid it off, 15-year note, sold it during the gentrification beginnings of it, or no, right in the middle of it, for $230,000. Bought a second house with that money and savings, paid cash. That's great for me, who moved here as a musician in the 1980s. A musician now, the pay is not much better. You're lucky to get $150 for a gig. A lot of musicians are even making less than that, especially if they play non-commercial music, non-New Orleans jazz, and do it for the love of the music. There's a lot of that going on as well, but they're not going to make $100. They're larger groups, they might make $50, but they do it. Several of them do it and then do other gigs that pay better. That they balance it that way. But even the musicians who say make $100 every night and play 365 times a year, $36,500 in income, you cannot buy a house. You can't, there's no house worth buying now that's under $200,000. So that wasn't the case with practically the same income 30 years ago. And that's a problem. My solution to surviving has been to learn New Orleans music, but then learn these also tangential musics. I've developed a strong solo career. I go around the country every summer and play house concerts and solo gigs. And then I've fallen into 3 gigs in the last, that all of them I've had 7 years. One is a solo piano gig, and the other 2 are duet gigs. Duet gigs, which if I wanted to make them quartet gigs, I wouldn't make any more. I'd make half as much money. But I'm a player with I play older jazz, so I can play the bass. I can play bass and rhythm, so I can get by as a duet, and therefore, it's not uncommon for me to make $300 for a gig, or a jazz fest even up to $500. But that's only 1 week a year. So that has enabled me to get by many weeks on 3 gigs, Whereas if I were a regular trad jazz guy, I would need 5 or even 6 gigs to make the same amount of money, depending on the venue. But it also turns out, because I've been doing this, and because my trad jazz is a little more modern than a lot of people would like it, I've been kind of shut out of some of the venues that are more traditional and kind of cliquish. I mean, they have their players that they like. They've been using them for 20 years. There's one guy who I've known for 30 years who has not hired me once. I've hired him a couple times, but he's had many opportunities. For instance, there's another club, the Palm Court Jazz Cafe. I had a steady gig there once, about in the 90s. And I think I've played there once or twice since then. I've never played Preservation Hall. There's a couple clubs on Bourbon Street. One I don't want to play because the pay is so horrible. 5 hours, like $88. No, thank you. The other one It's not that pleasant, but the pay is pretty good. I would do it once in a while, but I'm not in the pot of musicians, it gets called. So at the current point it's a singer said to me, and I had never thought of this, but there's so many musicians who are moving to town that there aren't enough gigs. Whereas it seemed to me before, if you were a really good player, you could eke out or do okay as a living as a player here. And of course, then there's always the sideline of teaching, either privately or if you're a modern jazz player, you get a job in academia and ideally get tenured. Sometimes you don't, but if you get tenured, then that's it, you know. You can pretty much even quit playing, you know, jazz. And I've seen both examples of tenured players who've kept up their musical skills and have really, you know, just gotten better and better. And then tenured players who've kind of loafed musically, and because they got tenure, they're not nearly as strong. I moved here when I was 26. I moved here, and I had a master's degree. And at one point, I got that master's degree because I was the jazz and rock critic for the St. Louis morning paper, the Globe Democrat, which is a horrible conservative rag, which has long since vanished. But I had a great editor, really smart editor, super smart writer. And I told him I wanted to get a job as a music critic. And he said, well, you need a music degree, because my undergrad was in art. And so I went to a local college on scholarship. It was painless. I didn't learn much, but I got a music degree, but it didn't help me. And and in a way, I'm glad I didn't follow that path, because as a believer in karma, I think that would have had devastating results in the long run for me to be so critical of other musicians. I still write about music, but it's primarily record reviews, and only records I like and I think should get attention, just for Offbeat, this local. It's the only New Orleans music mag out there, really. So.
What do you think is happening we've heard about the younger musicians in New Orleans being, you know, part of a multi-generational line. And what do you think, or what are you observing happening with them? Are they able to eke out a living? What's happening with them?
Well, that is typically a black phenomenon, although there are, you know, of course, it's not as widespread in the native white New Orleans world, but it is there to a lesser degree. But yes, let me think. Well, of course, the biggest name, the guy who's getting the biggest push right now is Trombone Shorty. He's part of the Andrews clan. He's tied to Jesse Hill, and he's part of the tree. And very talented guy. He's been playing trombone and trumpet since he was. There's many photos of him toting a trombone when he was this big. Good singer, good entertainer. But it's really curious, and I talk about this in that thing I just sent you, in that we're getting these people kind of representing us who have never had hits, who maybe have never even written a song that's worthy of being a hit. And it's just so strange to me, and it makes me wonder oh, I know it's not good for New Orleans music that the last person who's created a repertoire of songs that we play 40 years later is Alan Toussaint, who just passed away, of course. And he was primarily the 60s and 70s and a little bit, I think, into the 80s. I don't know when his last hit was. But even today, Trombone Shorty, no hits. I don't know if radio is capable of having a New Orleans-centric hit at this point. It's changed. It's been, as I understand, bought up by, it's like 6 radio people who own every radio station. And there's just nothing. I mean, I can't imagine something like Bobby McFerrin's "Don't Worry, Be Happy" being a hit today. The radio is all so homogenized and formulaic. It doesn't. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't music besides radio. It just means that what is going to become an anthem or a standard. Harry Connick Jr., Wynton Marsalis, superstars in their respective fields, have not written a standard that we will play 40 years from now. Even people at the very top of the game. So I think that's a problem. For me, playing, since the music I love is primarily older anyway, it's not that big a deal, but I can see that it is, in the long term, a problem. So there is new music being created here, but I don't think it's music that's going to captivate much of the world. I think New Orleans, for the time being, is just going to be the place where you go hear older music, and maybe older music just done in a better way than you're used to hearing it. Because there are Dixieland bands, for instance, all over the world. I've played with all Japanese bands in Japan. I've played with all South American bands in South America. And of course, many American bands. Mostly older white guys, few female singers, Nobody's ever heard of them. Nobody ever pays attention to them except trad jazz nuts. And there's some good ones. They're very faithful, but they don't have the New Orleans drumming, which I think is, unless they purposely, like there are good brass bands, all New Orleans style brass bands all over the country who do get the importance of New Orleans drumming. There's Mama Digdown in Madison. There's one in New York whose name I can't think of. So there are versions of that, but they don't have the New Orleans brand, so it's really hard for them to get any attention. I didn't really answer your question because I will say, though, that there definitely, in addition to mostly white musicians moving from out of town, but not entirely white, but mostly white, there are still young black phenoms coming up who are just so good at age 15 that you can't believe it. It takes a while for them to be heard. Joe Dyson is the new drummer, and now he's probably in his early 20s, but I remember when he was 17 and people were saying, oh, that's the next Herlin Riley or the next Shannon Powell, and you could hear it. He was already so good. So are these African Americans part of these trees, the Bruniuses, the Barkers, the Andrews, whatever? Maybe or maybe not. I don't know that scene well enough. And I also should mention that I don't know the hip-hop rap bounce scene at all. It doesn't interest me. It's not my world. It's just, it's too corrosive for me. It's not what I look for in music. There's many other worlds I can relate to. I relate to Brazilian music and culture more than I do to the bounce culture here.
Is there been a resurgence of, because I know there were I've heard that there are quite a few Brazilian and Cuban restaurants, sort of like that influx of people after Katrina
yes.
is like moving into the area.
Yes, in a minor way. In a minor
Yes.
way, there were a lot of Brazilians here, and now there are actually two Brazilian choro bands currently playing, and neither of them are great yet, but I think both of them have some Brazilians playing, which is always what you want. And as far as Cuban music, there's not a strong Cuban music scene. There's a guy named Hector Gallardo who moved here early on, who helped a lot, and then there's Michael Skinkis, who's gone to Cuba and studied it, and John Cleary, who's been to Cuba a lot, and I think is made the most interesting fusion of New Orleans R&B and Cuban music. Like you'll hear him play Tipatina, and he's taught his band how to play Tipatina as a Cuban piece of music, and he'll go into that in the middle of a funk version of Tipatina, and it's really marvelous. So I think he may be the single most talented musician in town anyway, but I really love the way he ties New Orleans to Cuba. He's an encyclopedia of African American music. Not jazz per se, or certainly not ragtime, but no, once again, my thread is lost.
Oh, that's all right. It's getting on in the interview too. Usually after about 40 or 50 minutes, people are
yeah.
like, what are we doing now? So, what would you, like I said, one of the reasons I got this started is friends of mine said, well, you know, we want to say what we want to say as opposed to people talking about us. So is there anything you would want people to know about New Orleans, especially from your perspective as a trad jazz musician from here?
Well, you know, as a trad player who can't really play modern jazz too well, you do get looked down on. But I think that's lessening, and people realize, well, to really play traditional jazz well is as hard as playing modern jazz well. I would say harder in a way because there's less notes you're allowed, and you have to learn a whole new repertoire to do it. But people do. People come here and they're forced to do it, you know, and eventually maybe they fall in love with it and they play it. I wanted to make another point on camera that if you want to know about the current bounce scene, do you know a woman named Allison Fensterstock?
No.
She is the go-to woman, I would say. There's also a woman named Holly Hobbs, and you can find them both on Facebook. Allison is a writer for either the Advocate or NOLA.com, or NOLA, the Times-Picayune. It's online. It's called NOLA.com.
Yeah.
We had a schism a few years ago, and the daily paper decided to only publish 4 days a week, and it was a catastrophe. And the second paper said, okay, well, we'll fill the void. And then the original paper went back to 7 days, but massive cuts, less arts coverage. But Allison has really made a point of covering the bounce scene, and I recommend you talk to her, and because she's been here a while, she would know the post bounce predicament. I thought it had been kind of wiped away because I read Nick Cohn's book called Trickster. Triksta, Triksta, and he's a friend of mine. I mentioned him in that piece I sent you, but I actually just wrote him yesterday and said, I'm going to give this lecture, can I use your name? And he said, I'd rather you didn't because it's a little more complicated than what you say in there. I said, okay. So, Holly Hobbs is director of the New Orleans Hip Hop Archive, whatever that is. Like I said, it doesn't much interest me, so I haven't bothered to explore it. But she got her degree from Tulane, I think, and now she's, I don't know if she does anything in the music business. I know she sells jewelry and perhaps has a shop doing that. So I would recommend either of them for further research, because that's, that has been the innovative music out of New Orleans. It's just not, it's just, I don't know, it's not my world.
So I also like to give these guys the opportunity to ask a question. Is there anything you guys were thinking of? A question you're going to ask?
I guess like with the gentrification and everything that you're talking about, do you see there being like a cap to this, or like what do you envision as happening in the future?
Well, people are fighting it. And I think a lot of it is, people are furious at the Airbnb phenomenon, which is illegal, according to the city charter. But the city council caved in. And basically, so that, I don't know, I hope it's a trend that dies out, but it appears to be getting stronger and stronger. People are fighting the scale of buildings. See, the problem is people are building new buildings somewhat in... Oh.
You knocked your mic off.
I'm sorry.
Down inside your thing, or if you want to zip and reach down there.
Okay. Sorry.
It's all right. People tend to forget that it's there.
Well, that's what you want.
Yeah, right? You can keep it. Sorry.
Gentrification, yes. A problem is, for me, and for many other people, I'm sure, is so you have neighborhoods and then you have one empty lot. And because it's more profitable, people will build a 2-story house in the middle of a row of 1-story buildings, and the cohesion is lost. And they usually try and replicate what's around them, but they can't because the artistry is just not, and the costs prohibit, You would think that it wouldn't cost that much to just add a little gingerbread to, and every once in a while you see that, but separate from neighborhoods where you're on a block that's an isolated block, you see buildings that could be anywhere USA, It could be in Houston, and you wonder, why did these people do that? But somebody who used to lead the Louisiana Endowment for the Arts organization, I can't think of his name, very smart guy, he said, one of the biggest problems for New Orleans is they never created a 20th century New Orleans upgrading of the style. So, whereas other cities have managed to do that, there's no equivalent in New Orleans. So either you get this throwback to the 19th century, usually in a dumbed down version, or you get something that could be in Houston. So I see the city slowly turning that way, building by building. And yet there's so much good stuff still here and so much left to reinvigorate, to, that I'm hopeful at an architectural level, if not at a societal level. There's always going to be brass bands here, and gospel choirs, and the Mardi Gras Indians have gotten a big boost. They're more prominent than ever. They're more commercial than ever. They didn't used to be commercial at all. They've never made money. Maybe once in a while they go out on tour. But now they're like brass bands, which is a little strange because it was supposed to be this inside, thing. But, if they can make money from it and spread the idea of Mardi Gras Indianness to Dayton, Ohio, I guess that's a good thing.